How's it going, guys? And welcome back here for another episode with some Pod Limit Omaha content. And we are jumping straight into the action here, reviewing a session that I recently played at PLO 50. Now, if you guys like this content, then please make sure to give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment below if you want to see more of myself making content like this. I would say let's jump straight into it. This is a pre-recorded session, and we're gonna review the hands and basically walk myself and you guys through what happened in this session. Okay, I would say let's get into it. I also have PLO Trainer open in case I want to dive a little bit deeper into a spot. On the left side we have ace, king, jack, triple suited in middle position, and on the right side we have a pretty straightforward fold with ace 9-9-5 against a middle position open. On the left side, this is a board where I'm gonna do a lot of checking. Given my tight open raising range from middle position, this is not a board where I will have a lot of great hands. So I like to check and also check the majority of my best hands and basically take it from there. On the turn 5, I expect myself to have very often the best hand at this point. My opponent will do a good amount of stabbing, I expect, on the flop with straights, with two pairs, with sets, and also with top pair. A very common bet by a lot of players, I would say. On the turn, pretty good spot to go for a delay, and on the river, it's close. I think we can go ahead and block bet. I do believe that my opponent will not have a straight or trips or better very often. So I still believe that I have the best hand. I could also check. I don't think that's necessarily a bad decision. I decided to go for a block and my opponent lays it down. Now, given the fact that I have the king as well, might actually checking makes that a little bit better because I block king, which could be a hand that is calling against my bet basically, but it is what it is. So this is a session played on the Rush and Cash games on ggpoker. As you can see, 2 tabling. I recorded the session and I had the intention when jumping into the session to be quite aggressive. And what I mean by that is that, first of all, whenever I had a decision whether or not to bet or check, and I was in doubt in a way, the intention that I had before the session was to go, in those decisions at least, for a bet. And I think that is a very good practice for a lot of players as well, because what often happens is that players tend to play a little bit too passive. And whenever you are too passive, you are not really fighting for pots, and you're not putting a lot of pressure on your opponent in situations where you might actually be able to do it, especially in situations where your opponent shows some sort of weakness. So that is one of the intentions that I had in this session. In doubt, go for a bet instead of going for a check. On the right side, we have bottom 2 pair, 3-way. I defended against a min raise, which is pretty loose, but a min raise, I mean, whatever. And I decided to lead out here, which I think is okay. The fact that we are 3-way in that situation makes my 2 pair more vulnerable and less comfortable to play check call. Now I decided to lead out, face a raise. I have a very easy fold, I would say, against my value, against the value raising part of my opponent. I am drawing very thin there, so folding makes a lot of sense. On the right side, this is not a hand you want to call or 3-bet. Too low suits, too much disconnection basically going on. On the left side, open raised on the cutoff, 10-10, 9-3 double suited. This is actually kind of interesting. Like when we think about the pre-flop open, the fact that we have 2 suits definitely makes this hand quite okay. But it's not a hand that will print a lot of money, I would say. But let's take a brief look into PLO Trainer. This is a low-stakes solution on ggpoker, and I'm going to open up the pre-flop range for the cutoff. We can see that the cutoff is supposed to open raise 31.3%. And if I filter down for 10, 9, 3 double suited. We see that this hand is actually supposed to be an open raise. 0.09 big blind is what we are winning here. If you have a single suited or a triple suited or a rainbow combination, we are always going to make the fold. Okay, great flop, of course, top set. Nothing else to do than bet, I would say. We don't have a hand that is completely crushing the board, which you then could sometimes consider to check back. But here we definitely don't have that, and we just want to build a pot. My opponent folds. In the meantime, on the right side, I didn't follow what happened. So let's go back. I open middle position, standard, check back, which also makes a lot of sense, I would say. And on the turn, I pick up a rep. I definitely want to go ahead and bet. I have no showdown value yet, and my opponent checks twice. And this is also one of those spots here where on the river, I was not entirely sure whether bluffing here makes a lot of sense. And that is because, I mean, the main reason basically is that if I bet really large on the turn, right, and my opponent calls there, my opponent's range suddenly becomes a lot stronger, right? And on the river, I do block a good amount of the missed straight draws. However, I still unblock hearts, and I still unblock some lower straight draws at least that missed. So I believe that I should still go ahead and bet the river. I decided to go for full pot, which probably is the sizing to go with. I would value bet here like 10-10 plus, queen 10, probably go for half pot. Also depending on the side cards a little bit. But having no showdown value, my opponent basically only check calls on the turn. I think we do have a bluff on the river. Again, I was a little bit unsure. I decided to go for it again as the rule was. And my opponent shows up with ace, queen, jack, 5, which was a little bit of a surprise to me. First of all, like, I think that my opponent, at least that's how I perceive these players to play, is that very often on the turn, they would go ahead and bet themselves after the flop goes check, check. So therefore, I undervalued his range in a sense, right? I wasn't expecting a pretty strong two-pair hand like this to be in there, which gives myself more incentive to bluff, right, if I expect his range to be weaker. But this player actually is capable of also check calling on the turn with some good hands, making his river range stronger. And yeah, that's it. I think his play on the turn, it's probably a bet with this two-pair hand, given that he has a nut gutter on top of it as well. But I don't blame the check that much, really. So I would say let's keep going. He calls me down, great call down, and I'm losing that pot. On table number 1, I flop middle pair and then open-ender. This is a hand that I want to check back. If I bet, I get raised. It's pretty uncomfortable. Now on the turn, I do want to bet, I think. It's a blank. My opponent again checks twice to me. I have some showdown value, but not a lot. I can still fold out hands like jack, jack, 10-10, 9-9, all those pairs. And my opponent's range simply isn't that strong, I expect. Now, I go ahead and take a similar route as the hand before, although this time it's a clear value bet on the river with my ace 7. I think this is very straightforward as played on the river. Turn is a little bit questionable, perhaps. But my opponent ends up calling down with a boat, turning deuce-deuce. Now, what do we think about my opponent's play? First off, pre-flop, it's definitely too loose. This is not a hand you want to call in the small blind against a under-the-gun open raise. And secondly, on the turn as played, when the flop goes check-check, I think his hand makes a good check raise. I think check calling is a little bit too passive. So I would go ahead and check raise on the turn, and as played on the river, I mean, the river might even be a check raise. I'm not entirely sure there, but it is what it is. I lose, and we are moving on to the next one on the right. I think I defended on the button against a min raise. We are 4-way on the flop right now. We do have something going on with a gutter, a pair, a 10 of clubs. So if they check to me, I think this hand makes a decent stab. However, against the bet by the initial open raiser, this hand is a pretty straightforward fold, I would say. Ace Queen 8-4 single on the button. Definitely a hand I would open raise if I have the chance to. And on the right side, great hand, 3-betting, Ace Queen Queen 10 double suited. On the left, a little bit too loose to call, too weak to 3-bets. I would say this is just going to be a fold. On the right side, let's see what's going to happen. This player has only 15 VPIP, so pretty tight it seems. I flop an overpair and a gut shot. Now on this board, my opponent is, at least in theory, supposed to have a leading range. Like he will have a good amount of like 2 pairs, some straights, some sets, also a lot of 1 pair and straight draws. And I have a tight 3-betting range with a lot of overpairs, so he can put a lot of pressure on my range. I check back on the flop, pretty standard, and on the turn against this sizing, even like I think we just have a fold. The gutter is not enough there to go with, and I do lay it down. And on table number 1, I decide to bet on the flop, I think, and get check raised for a small sizing. I would say we have a straightforward call. Don't think we necessarily want to get it in right away. And on the turn queen, it is pretty tempting to just get it in here, but I don't expect a lot of fold equity really. And I still think my opponent will often have a king or better. So let's just check and realize my equity and go from there. And my opponent ends up having 2 pair, king 8-7 deuce. Would he fold that hand on the turn? I don't think so, to be honest. I don't think so. By the way, not a hand to call in the big blind pre-flop, right? On the left, this is a fold. Not strong enough to play on the button against an open there. And on table number 2, I would say I bet the turn after flop goes check, check. My opponent checking back the flop, basically saying he doesn't have ace, king, or better on the flop. He also limped, making his range pretty weak. So I would say on the river, I have a pretty good combination to barrel again. Try to get my opponent off a weak ace, a weak king. And we do take it down there, which is nice. Okay, on the right side, ace, king, 6-3 single. This is pretty loose, I would say. We do have the ace and the king, which are helpful components in our hand to create a bit more fold equity. We also have the ace high suit. Now the reason why I decided to open raise here, because I know that this is probably not an open in theory, like, is that there are 3 very tight players on my left. We have middle position 18 VPIP. We have the cutoff sitting on 7% VPIP and the button sitting on 15% VPIP. And whenever you see that table dynamics are playing out in a certain way, you can adjust your strategy, right? There's no need to stick to your default strategy if you know that your opponents are playing a certain style and you can take advantage of that. So therefore I decided to open raise this hand and basically extend my open raising range. But let's take a look at my under the gun RFI range, 18.4%. If we type in ace, king, 6-3 single suited, we can see that this hand is supposed to be a fold. Now, if we look into the EV difference, which basically compares the EV of folding versus the hypothetical EV of opening. So what would I win, or in this instance lose, if I would decide to open raise it? That would be 0.06 big blind, which in other words is 6 big blind per 100. So the question you want to ask yourself in a spot like this is, will I make up this loss in theory given the dynamics at the table? And I would say, given the fact that these players are so tight, and also there's a recreational player in the big blind, it probably is okay. Now we do face a 3-bet, and let's take a look at what is happening, because I decide to call, I think, if I remember correctly. Ace king 6-3. I do decide to call, which is also kind of interesting, right? So let's also jump into that. We face a 3-bet. We don't have this hand, right? So we have to mimic this hand in a certain hand class. So we have an ace without a pair that is single suited, and we do have the ace high suit, and we can see that we're actually calling only 19% of this hand class, guys. 19% of this hand class. What are the hands that we are calling? Well, we do see ace king 4-3 in there. So ace king 4-3, ace king 4-3 is a hand that we call. Now this hand is definitely a bit more disconnected. So this is probably not the right play by myself, basically. Especially when we think about my opponent 3-betting quite tight. I think just folding is the play. Anyway, on the flop, we have a straightforward check raise getting it in, I would say. My opponent was 3-betting 9-8-7-4 double. This is definitely too loose. You don't want to 3-bet a hand like this with 2 gaps there at the bottom. It's too marginal. But he still had decent equity on this flop, right? Like with the rep. And I think we take it down. Yes, we win. Nice. And let's move on to the next hand, basically. On the left side, queen, queen, 9-4 rainbow. Too weak to open from the cutoff. Queen, queen, 9-4 single suited with the queen high suit. Probably even also too weak. So definitely some connectivity needed there in the cutoff. Now let's see what happened. On the right side, I would defend against a small blind steal. And on the right side, generally, this is a hand that you want to check back. We don't really have any equity and great blockers. But I decided to go a little bit more aggressive, as mentioned before in this session. So I do take a stab. We do unblock kings and queens, with my opponent could check fold on the flop with. And I think in general, people under check raise or over check fold, basically. Now on the turn, I decided to barrel again. This is not a theoretical approved double barrel, but we do block the 10, blocking some turn 2 pairs. Given the fact that my opponent didn't check raise, I think going a little bit more aggressive there. I mean, in the spirit of the goal of the session, basically, I think it's fine, but you definitely don't want to do that all the time. On the right side, this is an easy check call with my overpair backdoor straight opportunities, 2 backdoor flush draws, some backdoor blockers, or basically some straight draw blockers with the jacks. So I go ahead and check call. And on the 9, I would say I have a pretty good candidate to lead out. We don't have much showdown value at this point anymore. And I turn basically the uber or the best blockers at this point, blocking queen jack and jack 7. So I lead out with the intention to barrel off on a good amount of rivers, and my opponent luckily folds. Okay, let's see if there's any more interesting action. Like this session definitely had some bigger pots, guys. So it's very likely that I'm actually gonna make like another video out of this session. I recorded about 1 hour of footage, and there were some very big pots in there. So we're probably gonna do that, and I don't wanna make this video too long. On the left side, king, king, 10, deuce. Single against a loose player. I think 3-betting here is completely fine. And I flop top set. What a beautiful hand, guys. What a beautiful hand. I think unblocking all the straight draws and the low pairs, I do want to go ahead and bet. Just build a pot. And on the right side, in the meantime, I decide to call on the flop in a 3-bet pot. And on the left side, we do get it in actually against a rep. And we have 63% equity. On the right side, in the meantime, I turn 2 pair on a very dynamic board, I would say. But we do have the straight draw with the 10-8. So I like to see myself betting here. Also blocking some of his check raises, right? Blocking king, 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 jack. We block the turned set potentially. So I like to go ahead and value bet on the turn. Don't expect to get check raised that often, really. On the left side, we actually lost, unfortunately, but it is what it is. And we are open raising ace, king 4 single suited on the left side, pretty standard. And king jack 9 3 single is just going to be a fold in the big blind. Queen 10 6 single. This is a hand that I would like to see myself ISO raising against a limper. Definitely strong enough there. And check on the flop, I would say. Yeah, three-way, I think checking here is the way to go. We could go very small and sort of push out the button, but I generally like to go ahead and check in a spot like this. And bet a bit more polarized, basically. This is so much a medium strong hand at that point. And against the stab in position, I think we just have a check fold, unfortunately, with the overpair, but it is what it is. King jack 6 4. This would be a hand that I open raise myself, but against an open raise and a call, especially, this is just going to be a fold. Whenever you are in these overcalling situations, you need to focus on nuttiness, hands that perform well when there are multiple players in the pot. You want to be the guy who is dominating your opponent, basically, instead of the one being dominated by your opponent. So keep that in mind. It's a very common mistake, I would say, to play a bit too many hands. Now, of course, it depends on the opposition and your opponent, so extending your range every now and then is completely fine. But in general, keep in mind that the concept holds true that if there are more players in the pot, you want to tighten up your calling ranges, basically. On the right side, I think this is a 3-bet pot. I called a 3-bet again pretty loose. Generally, this is just going to be a hand that you want to fold. I lead out on the flop with my blocker and gutter. I think that is fine. And on the turn, I'm going to block bet my hand. I like it. We block some boats. We can get value against spades. It's not that likely that my opponent is holding a boat at this point. And on the river, I think going for the same strategy again is fine. Like if we check and my opponent bets, it's very uncomfortable, really. And this way, there's also some value against the 9, which is a hand that would probably just check back on the river itself. Okay, let's do a few more hands here. On the left side, this is definitely an open on the button. Ace 8 6 5 triple suited. And on this flop, I think this is a decent candidate to go ahead and bet. We have a diamond, we have a hard blocker, we have a gutter, we have a pair blocker. So we have 3 cards basically that are interacting very well with the board. And if I get check raised, like it's not the end of the world, right? Like I have not that much equity. Now the problem is that my opponent was a bit more short stacked, which give him incentive to check raise more aggressively. So I think in hindsight, checking back there is not that bad, to be honest. I might even prefer checking back here now that I think about his stack size. Okay, ace queen 7 4, standard fold on the right side. Let's take a look. Is there anything? On the left side, I will defend against a small raise. Now my opponent is quite tight, so it's not great. Generally speaking, I wouldn't mind a fold, but I did decide to go ahead and call. My opponent bets half pot, and we have a decent candidate to go ahead and check raise with my 4 blockers, with my queen blocker and the king. We have some potential here. I cannot check call, so it's either check fold or check raise. The problem is that my opponent is quite tight, it seems, pre-flop. And also his timing on the flop might be a little bit suspicious. Anyway, I'm gonna wrap up this session, guys. And we will continue our next session with the hand on the right, so make sure to stay tuned for that to see what's going to happen. If you enjoyed this episode, guys, then make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And if you want to dive deeper into the great game of Pot Limit Omaha, then check out the PLO Mastermind unveilingpoker.com, where not only myself, but also other poker professionals are teaching the great game of PLO. So guys, thank you very much for watching. Over and out, and I will catch you in the next one.